Bismillah Rahman Rahim. Assalamu alaikum, dear students. The current session focuses on an introduction to current communicative approaches and the background of communicative language teaching. I hope and expect by the end of this session you will have an introduction to the current communicative approaches, and you would also have some know-how of the origin and the background of communicative language teaching. Well, my dear students, the theoretical principles and classroom procedures of the language-centered pedagogy shaped language teaching and teacher education for nearly a quarter of a century. However, it was by the late 1960s and in the early 1970s that researchers and teachers simultaneously became increasingly skeptical and doubtful about the effectiveness of this pedagogy to realize its stated goal of fostering communicative capability in the learners. What was realized was that the main purpose of teaching language, if this has to be enable the learners to have communication in real life situations, then this teacher-centered set of pedagogies was not adequate for that. The skepticism or the doubt was grounded in the growing realization that the knowledge or the ability that is required to correctly manipulate the structures of the target language is only one part of what a learner has to learn in the process of learning a language. And to use those structures in a real-life situation to make choices out of those learned sets of structures is something else. Perhaps Newmark was one of the persons who played a very significant role in that, though a lot of other people, many researchers and linguists had started making remarks on that and had started pointing the flaws of the teacher-centered pedagogy. But Newmark's seminal paper, How Not to Interfere with Language Learning, that was published in 1966, it epitomized the doubts that prevailed among the language teaching professionals. And in fact, this was the paper that opened up for the first time new avenues of pedagogic thought. He, in this paper, doubted whether language learning can be additive and linear as a process, or can it be looked at as a set of learning process where language-centered pedagogists would maintain that this is a process that is incremental and in a linear function or in a linear form. The learner would learn one step and then move on to the next and yet to the next one. He asserted that if each phonological and syntactical rule, each complex of lexical features, each semantic value, or each stylistic nuance has to be learned in a sequential manner, one following the other, whether this would help the learners in real life situation or not. And actually, one of the points that he made was that this is not how people come across language in their real life. In short, each item which the linguist's analysis leads him to identify had to be acquired one at a time, proceeding from simplest to most complex, and then each had to be connected to the specified stimulus or the set of stimulus, and the child learner would be old before he could say a single appropriate thing, and the adult learner, according to him, he sarcastically said, would be dead till he or she would be able to learn one after the other this whole long sequence of all the items. So his main plea was that this one after the other sequenced, structured, pre-planned kind of presentation of the learning items to the learner should not be done, because it does not work. So Newmark argued against it, and he adopted the view that complex bits of language are learned a whole chunk at a time rather than learned as an assemblage of constituent items. He also declared that language-centered pedagogy, with its emphasis on sequential presentation, on production and practice processes of isolated linguistic items, constitutes serious interference with the language learning. because he believed that this is not how we come across language in our daily life. Interestingly, almost all of the developments either occurred or became prominent in the 1960s with this reference, precisely when dissatisfaction with language-centered pedagogy was growing. Side by side, a lot of other developments were taking place in the field of linguistics. For example, in linguistics, Chomsky demonstrated the generative nature of language system at that time, claiming that human beings can create infinite number of sentences that they have not heard or they have not come across before, based on the knowledge that is stored in their minds. At the same time, Halliday provided a different perspective to language, highlighting its functional properties. In social linguistics, there was some work of Himes, who proposed a theory of communicative competence incorporating sociocultural norms that govern language communication. So Himes was the person who brought the sociocultural perspective into the language and into the communication process. Austin's speech acts theory also simultaneously, on the same timeline, it emerged, and it elaborated on how language users perform speech acts, how different functions actually, according to Austin, are performed by the speakers of a language. For example, how do they perform the functions of request, of informing, of apologizing, of ordering, etc. Sociolinguists were developing communication models to explain how language is to be used and how its use is to construct kind of social networks of people. Now, a development that was unrelated to the academic disciplines that I have already mentioned, like in linguistics, for example, but one that hastened the search for an alternative method was the formation of European Economic Community. This European Economic Community that we also call EEC, though directly it was not linked with the theories or methods or approaches towards language teaching and learning, but indirectly it had a very strong impact, because this European Economic Community was a common market of Western European countries, and it was a precursor to the current European Union, and thus it actually created the situations where the learners had to learn certain kind of communicative skills, and they had to learn language to operate in certain kind of communicative contexts. By deliberate policy, the EEC eased trade and travel restrictions within multilingual Europe, which in turn provided an impetus for greater interaction amongst the people, where, people from these small countries, they would be able to meet each other more, they would be able to travel more, and thus, there would be more interaction, which would lead towards more needs of communication. So it provided a reason for developing a function-oriented language where people, there was a need for developing a methodology of teaching language or to take a perspective on teaching language that would enable the learners to have a function-oriented language teaching pedagogy, and that would enable the teachers to prepare the learners to use language in real-life contexts. In all this context, it was in 1971 that the Council of Europe, a wing of EEC, commissioned a group of European applied linguists and entrusted them with the task. They were given the task to design a new way of teaching foreign languages. And if I say that this was the beginning of the communicative approaches towards teaching language, and this was the background of communicative language teaching, or CLT, I think it would be very much correct. Learning from the shortcomings of language-centered pedagogy and drawing from the newly available psychological and linguistic insights that I have talked about, that came from Himes, that came from Chomsky, that came from Halliday, and that came from many other people from the field of psychology as well. In the light of all this, Wilkins proposed a set of syllabuses for language teaching. This was published as a monograph originally in 1972. Later on, it was revised and it was expanded as well, and it reappeared in 1976 as a book that was titled as National Syllabuses. Now, instead of merely giving a grammatical core, this new syllabus did not only provide the structures, or it did not only provide the categories of notions such as time, sequence, quantity, location, frequency, or any other categories of communicative functions. It actually dealt with the real life communicative functions of how to inform, how to request, how to command, how to give instructions, etc. So, there was a complete shift, there was a complete change from a more structuralist perspective on language and language teaching to a more communicative perspective on language and language teaching. The notional or functional syllabus, as it was known, so there were different names that were used. It was called notional syllabus or functional syllabus, and it provided actually a new way of exploiting the situations in which dialogues would be used, and for different kind of functional properties, different kind of structures would be used and would be integrated into the dialogues depending upon the needs of a communicative situation. Thus began a language teaching movement, which later became well known as communicative method or communicative approach or simply communicative language teaching. So all these terms are interchangeably used, in fact, I would say, in the field of education and in the field of language teaching. The watchword here is the word communication, which is common in all the three. Well, my dear students, communicative language teaching is not a monolithic entity. It is not a single entity. It is not one particular thing that you would say, this is communicative language teaching. These are its parameters. In fact, different teachers, different educators, different educationists, different psychologists, different linguists, they have contributed to it in different ways at different times. And whatsoever had already been contributed, different practitioners, educationists, and teachers, they have interpreted in their own contexts. They have interpreted it in different ways. So within a set of broadly accepted theoretical frameworks or the theoretical principles that are related to communicative language teaching, there are multiple variations of the interpretations of communicative language teaching, and actually there are multiple methods that are used in communicative language teaching as well.